Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at Canadian Parliament alleged the agents of Indian government were involved in the killing of Canadian national Hardeep Singh Nijjar, which is actually from the Khalistani movement, and that movement was very much active in a few years ago, especially in 60s and 70s, and after that the chain of events happened. For that we have two expert speakers. First we have Dr. Ashwini RS, who is an assistant professor, selection grade from the School of Liberal Studies of UPSC, and whose research interests lie in the intersection of security, strategy and environment, who has PhD and MPhil from University of Kerala. So without further delay, I'd like to invite Dr. Ashwini to give a perspective about India-Canada bilateral relations and the foreign policy. So over to you, Ashwini. Thank you.
One thing that if the ongoing drift between India and Canada has taught us, it is that all politics is global in nature. All politics, whether it's our national politics or a regional issue that's happening, has global repercussions. So when Canada opened its borders to let immigrants come in, so they have a very liberal immigration policy. They allow a lot of expats to reach Canada and settle down there with their expansive PR policies and quick citizenship policies. So while Canada was importing all these exiled immigrants from India or any other country, it is also importing the domestic politics, the national politics of those countries to Canada, right? So that's something that we quickly sort of realize through the ongoing issues that's happening. So while the Canada had opened doors in the late 1940s and 1950s to people of Indian origin, to reach there and settle down, the domestic issues that was sort of boiling in India's national politics, like the Khalistani movement, also sort of got imported out of India, quite literally, but to the Canadian politics. While it is also true that we are having all these ongoing discussions on the Sikhs for terror and Khalistani movement, we need to also understand that not all the 8 lakh people that lives in Canada has everything to do with the Sikh for terror or the Khalistani movement. Don't have. So I also want to bring to your attention to a similar incident that has happened in the 1980s with the tigers, the Tamil tigers in Sri Lanka. Was also something similar. It was also importing the domestic politics in Tamil Nadu region to the Sri Lankan politics, right? So, and which sort of died in the early 2000s. But similar to what the Tamil tigers were doing in Sri Lanka, which was extracting money from other people of Indian origin, the Khalistani movement is also, the militants are also involved in extracting money from the Sikh businessmen, business people in Canada to sort of fuel the militancy, and by force. It's not by their own interest, but by force. So while we understand that Indians have Indian diaspora is one of the predominating factor in the Canadian politics currently, with the defense minister being of Sikh origin and many other parliamentarians being of Indian origin, we also need to understand that while there's an aggressive China playing out its tactics in the global politics, and a real aggressor, Russia, in the the Ukraine crisis that we see, Canada would need India. So in 2022, Canada released its Indo-Pacific strategy, where it identified India as a critical partner to Canada. And that, if you understand the Indo-Pacific politics, it is the fact that China is having its expansive measures in South Asia. Like if you look at Pakistan, for example, China is investing a lot in their infrastructural projects and building a road connecting Pakistan's Gwadar port to China, right? So that they can basically not use the Indian Ocean to ship the 85% of their oil supplies go through Indian Ocean. Now with the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, by the way, which goes through the Pak-occupied Kashmir, right, which is again a geopolitically sensitive issue. So that is one big infrastructural project that China is doing here, right? And then you already know what China did to Sri Lanka. I'm just talking about the leverage here. So for Canada, of course, currently you know that the trade delegation that was supposed to happen is postponed. You also know the tit for tat measures that are happening. So Canada's leverage in this situation is trade, and India's leverage in this trade are twofold. So India sort of has, my argument is that India has a upper hand in leverage in this situation by two means. One is Indian students who are studying in Canada, which accounts to 40% of their international students, and tuition fees, right? The second is what I just talked about, the geostrategic counterbalancing that India can offer in the Indo-Pacific. So I believe that the impasse, what that's happening, might be short-lived, it might be long-lasting. However it is, I believe whatever is going to be the repercussions of it, it would be much more on Canada than on India.
Thank you, Dr. Ashwini, for giving your perspective. And so definitely you mentioned about the Indian immigrants and the students. So for that other part of our discussions, I'd like to request Dr. Roshni Sengupta, who is an associate professor of School of Modern Media, and she was previously assistant professor at Institute of Intercultural Studies, Jagiellonian University, Poland, and she was from Lady Sri Ram College. Then she has earned her PhD and MPhil from JNU, so, and who is also an expert on the diaspora studies. So I'd like to request Dr. Roshni for giving the perspective on other part of the Indo-Canada relations. Yeah, Dr. Roshni.
I'm going to take off from where Dr. Ashwini stopped, and she did mention the fact that one of the biggest links that India and Canada have are essentially the people-to-people links between essentially in terms of the students, number of students that make up the community of youth in various Canadian universities, as well as the diaspora, which is one of the largest Indian diaspora settled anywhere in the world. In fact, Canada is the world's largest Sikh population. Canada hosts the world's largest Sikh population outside of India, right? Which essentially is is the bulwark of the relationship between India and Canada. It's people, right? So India has been importing its people to Canada in several tidal waves, right? But I would like to take you back a little into history, back to 1914. There was an incident which became famous after that, by the name of the Komagata Maru incident. The Komagata Maru incident essentially involved a steamship, a Japanese steamship named Komagata Maru, which was carrying about 140 Indians on board, but mainly Sikhs, who wanted to go to Canada. This was during the colonial period, of course, 1914. They wanted to go to Canada, disembark and settle down there, start jobs and businesses and so on. But at the time, because of the colonial policies, the Canadian immigration laws were extremely strict. They just stopped people from entering Canada. They stopped the ship on the, I think it was the Ottawa port where Komagata Maru was anchored for a while. The people were not allowed to disembark. And after a lot of coaxing and cajoling, the authorities came and really asked them to go back to India. So these were people who were on the ship without food, without water for a long time. The ship came back to Calcutta, and during that, the voyage back from Ottawa to Calcutta, the people on the ship decided to mutiny. They decided to mutiny, and when they were back in Calcutta, the mutiny occurred. There was a lot of violence, a violent repression from the side of the colonial authorities, killing about 44 Indians in that incident, right? So after that, Canadian relations, I mean India's relations with colonial Canada, colonial India's relations with colonial Canada kind of soured for a considerable period of time, but the pre-colonial and post-colonial migration continued, right? It was only in 2016 that the Prime Minister Trudeau officially apologized for the colonial policies, the harsh immigration policies during the colonial period, and he officially apologized for the killing of those 44 Indians on Komagata Maru ship. So from that time onwards, you know, one of these historical baggages is seen to have dissipated. But you have something else going on right now, which Dr. Ashwini has very clearly sort of described. But like I said, the immigration did not stop in the pre-colonial and post-colonial period to Canada. But one significant point that I want to make about the kind of immigration that Canada accepted and the tidal waves of immigration that occurred were essentially for filling up blue-collar positions in the Canadian workforce. Right? This is quite dissimilar to the kind of migration that occurred to the southern neighbor, Canada's southern neighbor, that is the United States, where predominantly white-collar tech workers they were the ones who went and settled down after the early colonial period, when agricultural workers also went. People working for the railroad industry also went, right? But later on, it was the white collar industry that attracted most of the migrants. In Canada, it's the blue collar workers who were preferred in these tidal waves. So essentially, what happened was that a lot of that has resulted in a visa PR industry, kind of an industry that has grown in Punjab, which sends people out on student visas, on a lot of their paperwork is false, it's fake, and so on, and all of that is discovered once these people reach Canadian shores. So Canadian immigration policies are expansive, as Dr. Ashwini said. They are easy, they are simpler than other countries, and therefore people prefer, Indians from the middle and lower income groups prefer to migrate to Canada for better economic opportunities and a better life. But what has happened is that along with this huge population that has migrated, the politics of that population has also, like she said, migrated to the country. Another important point about Canada is that because it has a large diaspora, it's seen as a friendly country by subsequent migrants. So they see it as a friendly country where the process of homemaking would be simpler. Because there are so many Indians, people feel that going to Canada is an easier option, it's a better option. We'd be happy there because there are so many Indians already, we'll feel at home. So the process of homemaking, which is essentially part of diaspora theory, where diasporas, indulge in homemaking practices all across the world, it becomes considerably easy in a country like Canada, which essentially is the reason why people prefer to migrate to Canada. I'll just briefly touch upon the salience of the Khalistani movement and as it has and its growth and development and its existence in the diaspora in Canada. It won't be wrong initially to say that the Khalistani movement pretty much exists in the minds of the diaspora and not on the ground in Punjab, right? There might be new vestiges of extremism brewing now because of the radical elements in different parts of the world. But for a longish period of time, Punjab was very, very tired of the militancy era. And the demand for Khalistan had pretty much died down. But the demand for Khalistan did not die down in one sphere, and that is a diaspora. It remained alive, right? So there is a continuing relevance of the idea of a separate Sikh state in the Sikh diaspora, particularly in Canada, which has the largest Sikh diaspora in the world. So you find, the early setting up of organizations like the International Golden Temple Organization in Canada, the Sikh World Festival organization in Canada. So the building up of an empathy and solidarity with co-ethnic members in that community. So it was in the 1950s and 60s when the Khalistan or pro-separatist leader Jagjit Singh Chauhan first raised the issue of a separate Sikh state. And he raised it in Britain, in Canada, and in the United States. To the extent that a consulate was established in Canada, a consul's office or a consulate was established in Canada, essentially for the non-existent Republic of Khalistan. So of course, nobody recognized the republic, so it was seen as a non-existent Republic of Khalistan. And this consulate started issuing Khalistani passports and also minting Khalsa currency. So in Canada, in the 50s and 60s, you had Khalsa currency being minted and Khalistani passports being issued. They also started something called Babbar Khalsa. Babbar Khalsa was essentially a monthly magazine which they started from the consulate, so-called consulate. And later, Babbar Khalsa International became one of the driving forces of Sikh separatism in the diaspora. And you know, all of this sort of reached a head in 1985 with the bombing of the Air India plane, passenger plane, over the coast of Ireland, over a place called Lockerbie, also known as, so that's why it's also known as the Lockerbie killings or the Lockerbie bombings, in which 329 Indians, Canadians and the crew died. And this act of terror was carried out by the organization known as the Babbar Khalsa International, members of which were later arrested in Canada. One of them was someone called Talvinder Singh Parmar, who Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, had sought the extradition of. She wanted to extradite Parmar back to India and try him for terrorism, but the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Pierre Trudeau, who is incidentally Justin Trudeau's father, refused to extradite Mr. Parmar back to India. And then Mr. Parmar in 1985 went on to bomb the flight and kill 329 people. Another fact to remember is that after the 1984 killings or the 1984 massacres of Sikhs in North India, but primarily in the aftermath of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination and Operation Blue Star, a large number of Sikhs sought asylum and refuge in Canada. Canada being a very friendly country with a large Indian diaspora already. So from that period onwards, where the Khalistan Council was set up in 1970, this idea of a Sikh homeland has essentially existed in the minds of a diaspora, not really on the ground in Punjab. So that's essentially the point that I was wanting to make in terms of the diaspora and the demand for Khalistan, which is now one of the foundational, sort of matters which has caused this tension between India and Canada. Thanks.
Thank you, Roshni, for giving such a brilliant presentation about the history and touching up all the important issues. So now I'd like to, ask both the panelists one same question, then we may open for the floor. So Ashwini, of course, you mentioned about India as a stable democracy, which is very crucial if we see the current strategic changes even in the Indo-Pacific or even the rise in China. So what do you think, like how, because still the Canadian government is still very adamant and not much changes happen. So how do you see where it is heading to? And for Roshni, of course, similar, like, you mentioned about, because Sikh community is very, very crucial, and it will, in the long run, of course, it is very important for the community to maintain a very better bilateral relations. So what do you see? What is the solutions, or like what are the steps, like both the countries, because now already India has banned all the visa for Canadians, and which is a very, very strong step. And so both of you can do your concluding remarks on this. Yeah, so Ashwini first.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. You consistently see that we are not talking much about the nation states of Canada and India. The conversation is also moving out to people, to ethnicities, to militant groups and movements which are not anymore sovereign entities. Right, so ever since the Westphalian treaty that was passed, we were always looking at international politics from the lens of nation states. So I believe this is also an opportunity for students who are studying politics and the scholars who are working in this area to divert and start also focusing and having discourses around these transnational elements, these elements which are non-state in nature. They are not state, they do not have people, territory, government or sovereignty. These are entities which run parallel to governments but are stronger in a way, like this whole militancy or this movement was able to move bilateral relations. Just imagine the power of it having impact on, like, you remember that image of Trudeau stranded on the tarmac in New Delhi post the G20, right? Look at the impact of a transnational movement on the national politics of countries. So I believe the biggest challenge is that we are going to have more conversations around these transnational elements and the future. So what these movements can do is not something that we have studied so far. It's going to be something that's not written about, not studied, not predictable, because nation states we can keep them accountable in the international system, but these elements are very anarchic in nature, and how are we going to keep them accountable to what actions they are going to do? The threat to human security is no more military in nature. It is going to be about how we are going to deal with disinformation, for example. So Trudeau, as a Prime Minister of Canada, which is one of the biggest countries, could speak about so confidently about Indian government's involvement in Nijar's killing so confidently. It's been 10 days since the acquisition and we do not see any proof on it on the table. So what is this? What is it? A sort of a disinformation? So if it is a disinformation that could even move the Prime Minister of a country in a parliamentary discourse, then what is the power of these elements called disinformation and propaganda driving international politics? So I believe that's going to be the biggest threat, because we live in an era when we have a lot of devices. We have our phones, our iPads, our laptops, our multiple apps to give us data. Now WhatsApp also introduced channels, so you get multiple information. What is correct? What is the right information? So the biggest challenge to our security is going to be understanding and sort of figuring out right from wrong, which also is contextually here. It's, if one country has benefited out of this ongoing India-Canada bilateral issue, is again China. So if one party was able to sort of gain from it, which again is which I again want to take you back to this disinformation, where so if you have heard about this very interesting incident called Michael incident, have you heard about this thing? So basically, this telephone company of China known as, I think it's pronounced Hawaii, their CFO, Chief Financial Officer, was arrested. Her name is Wang. So she was arrested in Canada for some alleged issues in her involvement with Iran, some deal with Iran. So she was arrested in Canada, and China retorted to it by arresting two just visiting tourists in China. Their names were some Michael something and Michael something. I mean, I forgot the surname, so it was known as the Michael incident, where these two random tourists, Canadian tourists in China, was arrested. They still not sent out, and they were charged with espionage cases, which will command around 14 years of imprisonment in China, and Canada couldn't do anything about this, right? This is case one. Case two is, there are a lot of information coming out that China is involved in electoral frauds in Canada, with which Trudeau won the election. Right.
Last two elections.
So the second case. The third case is that there's a lot of money laundering issues happening in Canada, which is funded by China. Now Canada is also becoming a space of a haven for this terror funds, which in the 1970s Saudi Arabia was for Pakistan, which we saw the repercussions of it in our politics. All the terror attacks that happened in 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, right? So now Canada is also, because there's a lot of money laundering issues, a lot of cases and documents have been coming out. So this is a third issue. So repeatedly we are seeing Chinese interference in Canadian politics and Canada not able to take a stand. And even in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, if you remember, first Canada said we are not going to import Russian oil because Russia is an aggressor. We are clearly declaring Russia as an aggressor, and we are not going to import. Then what happened? Winter came. Canada didn't have any energy sources, and Canada had to open up and change its stance to import energy from Russia. Yeah. Again, diverting its stance. Again, it is a nuclear country. Also, so when India's relationship with Canada historically had been very, very it has been checkered. It's never been a very straightforward relationship. So even in Cold War, if you remember, in 1948 when the plebiscite, the memorandum for plebiscite was moved in UN, Canada supported plebiscite in the Kashmir issue. When we talk about 1954 Vietnam War, Canada very, very strategically and eloquently aligned with the US position, whereas India aligned with the pro-communist, the war on terror, nuclear. So 1974, our first nuclear test. So earlier we had like three mechanisms to sort of handle our nuclear energy, one of which was Canadian in nature, and the 1974 nuclear test that we did had elements of plutonium. Then it kind of really pissed Canada, saying that how can you do that? Like, we had an agreement that we'll be using nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. This is not allowed. And then we again went ahead and did the 1998 Pokhran crisis, which historically after the 1984 riots, I think this was the second time that whole bilateral relation came down. So I believe, like my concluding remarks in this whole conversation would be about the involvement of China in the whole issue, how they are sort of benefiting out of it needs to be discussed, because 2 hours before Canadian Prime Minister talked about this issue, Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army, their website had reports about deteriorating ties between India and Canada. It ran articles about it where trade delegations would be affected, and it did happen a couple of hours later. So China's involvement in it needs to be discussed, needs to come out. Second is the issue on transnational actors needs to be discussed, and the third is about the disinformation about these non-traditional security issues that we need to discuss beyond national military. A lot of things have been discussed and a lot of predictions have happened, but as young scholars in political sphere, you need to look at what are these emerging human security issues, and I need to have more discourses around it. Last remark is about this whole issue of tit for tat game that is being played. What is the role of gender in international relations? All these are, male, very machoistic tit for tat. You take two senior diplomats, we take 4 sort of a measure. So what is the role of gender in all this, diplomatic exchanges that's happening between India and Canada? And would you think more of a feminist international, relations perspective can sort of alter it and change it for the better?
Yeah, thank you, Aswini, for especially pointing out the role of non-state actors, which so important now, and of course, rise of China that we cannot ignore, and of course the feminist foreign policy, that is the whole game will be different if the leaders are women. So now, of course, Roshni, your concluding remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kaustav. I will just again take off from where Dr. Ashwini stopped. but also go forward with two of my two sort of main points that I want to make here. One is that of of course the transnational non-state actors that we have in terms of the growing or the maintenance of the Khalistan movement or the extremist movement for a separate state of Khalistan in the diaspora sphere particularly. But bring your attention to one important factor about the Sikh vote bank in Canada. Canada, as you know, is a two-party democracy essentially, with the Liberal Party and the Conservatives being the two players primarily. And because the Sikhs are a considerably large population, both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party are seen as people who are seen as political actors who cannot antagonize the Sikh community in Canada. So that is one group that they cannot do without, which is essentially geostrategic thinkers and observers would feel that that is something that the those who actually are trying to push the Khalistani agenda in Canada are arm twisting the current government with, that we pull out of your government, because remember, Justin Trudeau's government right now is a minority government. Without the help of Jagmeet Singh's National Democratic Party, the government falls. And just Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the National Democratic Party, has been widely recognized as a very, very strong supporter of the of a separate Sikh state in India, right? Besides China arm twisting Trudeau and Trudeau's government, there is the factor of the Sikh community within Canada, and the fact that both the Liberals and the Conservatives are pandering to vote bank politics within the domestic sphere. And therefore, I make the point about political compulsions, and the fact that vote bank politics plays a wide role in deciding foreign policy as well at some point, because this seems to be clearly sort of directed by a two-pronged arm twisting being done, on the one hand by China and on the other hand by the Sikh extremist groups within Canada. Of course, Canada is now also being seen very distinctly, particularly in Indian media discourses, as a safe haven for not only terrorists or extremists or separatists, but also gangsters and extortionists and so on and so forth. So suddenly the media is abuzz with a lot of information about how gangsters and people who are considered antisocial elements in India are running away to Canada on fake passports and so on, and staying there very, very safely, right? So that has also brought a lot of how much of that information is correct, how much of that information is disinformation, as Ashwini pointed out, is something that we need to question and we need to talk about. Of course, the Indian government has been sharing dossiers of information on these criminals who are, one of them of course was involved in the killing of Sidhu Moosewala, who also, by the way, was a Canadian PR holder. So he had a Canadian PR. He lived in Canada for a while and was in India for his wedding when he was killed. Right, and the entire nexus was then drawn back to Canada with the gangster Goldie Brar and so on and so forth being involved, right? So the souring of relations between India and Canada at the moment sort of begins in many ways from the murder of Sidhu Moosewala, and when India starts sharing information against these people who are very safely living in Canada right now with the Canadian authorities, and Canadian authorities refuse to act on any of that. A dossier was also shared on Nijjar, the person who's now the center or the pivot of this entire conversation. A dossier was shared by the Indian government with the Canadian authorities, and no action was taken on that dossier as well, which sort of listed out the 5 or 6 FIRs against Nijjar that have already been lodged in India and so on. So therefore, we kind of obviously need to talk about the transnational nature of politics right now. We need to talk about how the economic powerhouses are, trying to manipulate internal politics in a country such as Canada. Of course, there were allegations of Russians manipulating the elections in America as well. So this, of course, doesn't come as a surprise that China manipulated elections in Canada at all. But we also need to look at the internal domestic politics of countries like Canada with very large ethnic minority populations. So that is another conversation that needs to be had around this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshni. And so now the floor is open. If anyone, we have like around 5 minutes. So anyone wants to ask any question? Yeah, Debarjo.
I just had one question. So basically, we all know how many Indian students go to Canada to study, right? The education sector is huge when it comes to these two countries. And right now, as of 2023, there are more like 3,19,000 Indian students studying in Canada. So after this recent conflict, what do you think will be the entire scenario when it comes to education, especially? How are the students going to learn? What is going to be the the people in Canada, the students in India? What is the scene going to be like when it comes to the education sector? If you could just shed some light on that.
Okay, I can start with, you must be aware, Canada also sent back a lot of students because of fake fake documents. So it's the entire scam is also running like a business. So so definitely, we have to look at that, because whether it is a business or whether really there is an opportunity. And so I think better it has to be careful about what we are going for and what is happening. And yeah, so that is maybe any of our expert want to add. Yeah.
So I would just say that Canada and India have had tenuous relations through the years. So it's never been a very, it's never been bonhomie and camaraderie without strain. There has always been strain on several issues between India and Canada. But despite that, several waves of migration have occurred. Several students, the number of students who study in Canada has increased substantially. Yes. Right. So if you ask me, I do not think the conflict is going to have a long-standing or a binding impact on the number of students who go out to study in Canada. They would still go, right, unless Canada stops diplomatic access, which I don't think it will do, because then they lose huge amounts of revenue. The students who go from India to Canada also which also contributes to the Canadian economy. I do not think that's going to, this is going to, Canada is going to stop these waves of students coming into that country to study. So if any of you are planning to go to Canada, you can be rest assured, because the relations have been strained. They have never been, they're of course friendly, but they've never been without their own political strains. And even despite that, there has been an increase in number of students going to Canada to study, right? So that's basically what I wanted to say.
Besides that, the Canadian economy depends on migrants. Before this entire imbroglio, Trudeau himself said that they need about 4 million migrants to grow their economy. So that still stands.
So it's always been a checkered history. The relations between India and Canada have always been checkered. But despite that, we see, people moving out to Canada in hordes, particularly from Punjab and other parts of North India, including students. Yeah. So, that, it might, of course, like Ashwini said, have a short-term impact. But in the long run, I don't think we need to be overtly concerned about that.
Any more questions? Okay.
According to you, will it be easier if female leaders are there? Will they be able to handle all these situations which are happening more, not easily, but in a better way?
If you see that traditionally the foreign policy, it's mostly security challenges. And now the challenges have changed. It's more global. Like, pandemic was there, then environmental challenges. So maybe, women leaders are better decision makers because the problems have changed. Maybe you don't need a male perspective. If you see during the pandemic, the countries with a female leader, they did the best. Like whether it is Taiwan, New Zealand, many countries where has the women leader, which was a global challenge as well. So maybe, you know, the situation is changing. So it's, of course, it's a very hypothetical. If there's a women leader, they may act differently. So that is the debate going on in the international about a feminist perspective, you know, because the challenges are not the same. Here also, it's many issues are involved.